Welcome to Sex Help for Smart People. I'm your host, Dr. Laura Jurgens, former science professor turned somatic sexologist and intimacy coach. This podcast is all about using evidence-based practices to help high-achieving women and their partners of all genders get the affection, connection, and great sex you want. So let's get at it. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 3. So today we're talking about the path to freeing your arousal and desire. And we're going to really focus on what's different about arousal and desire, making sure we dig into what's missing from our definitions of these concepts and how that actually sets women up to struggle with both of them. And then we're going to close with a game-changing, easy exercise to help you get into your desire and get curious about your arousal. So let's jump in. So we're going to start with definitions because the language we use around things is incredibly important to how we think about them, and how we think about things really determines how we feel about them. So first up is arousal. And the medical or reductionist version is typically limited to physical arousal. That's typically what's defined. And when we're talking about sex, we're really thinking about genital arousal. So that's just one kind, but let's go through it. This tends to be the one everybody's most familiar with. And yet there are some important parts of the story missing. So it's commonly taught in sex ed in the US what happens when people with penises get physically aroused. Erections. Even though that's not really the whole story for them either. But I have literally never met a woman who had sex ed in the United States in school in which they talked about female genital arousal. So if you are an exception to that, please contact me. I would love to hear from you. And I want to celebrate whoever your sex ed teacher was. But think about this. You have an entire group of humans who are just, it's as if we don't get aroused, as if it's just not important, right? And I'll say, my experience as a girl and most people with vulvas, I know their experiences, we're actively discouraged from knowing anything about our physical arousal states. I mean, that omission is one way, right? Just ignoring it as a topic is discouraging. And it's no wonder most of us have hurried ourselves into different types of sexual activities without noticing if our bodies were ready because we don't know anything about what ready looks like, especially as teenagers. So, I mean, there's nothing sticking out. So we hide, and the vast majority of females have ignored our own arousal so often that we often don't even notice when we are actually aroused. This is really common for adult women to just not notice when we're physically aroused. And if that's you, first of all, it's super normal. And second of all, you can start noticing if you pay attention. It's not too hard. And most of us have learned eventually what it feels like and looks like for ourselves to be aroused. But just in case, and for the males out there who never really got this information either, people with vulvas have erectile tissue just like people with penises. Right? So labia swell up, tissues are engorged with blood during arousal, just like males, and there's fluid production just like males, right? So everybody gets wet and everybody gets hard in some ways, right? And this type of arousal, this erectile tissue swelling up and fluid production is a spectrum just like males, right? So it starts out sort of mild and it can get pretty intense if you continue to get more aroused. And ultimately, the clitoral hood will pull back, just like the analogous structure in males, the foreskin. And remember, these are just similar, same basic bits. They're just configured differently. So penises are basically just overgrown clits. And for this part, today I'm really going to use male and female to denote people with penises and vulvas respectively. And I just want to make a little side note. This has nothing to do with gender. Hopefully everybody understands this by now, but gender is essentially a giant social forced role play that is actually not related to sex except by habit and culture. So I want to acknowledge that there are folks who identify as women and men who have different parts than the stereotypical. And there's also intersex people who have some of both styles of sex organs. And that's also absolutely biologically normal and lovely also. Okay, so same bits, configured slightly differently in different folks, and they all get erect and they all get wet. That's physical arousal. But it's just one type of arousal. There is also the lesser known cousin, but really important, psychological arousal. And this is the part where you're experiencing emotional turn on. Everybody kind of knows this exists, but we don't often talk about it as a type of arousal, a psychological arousal. And we often don't really understand it. So what's going on here is different types of emotions are arousing to different folks. And we're going to dive into this in a whole episode on it. But I'm going to give you the gist today. There are common themes, even though everyone has this sort of unique mix of the emotions that really turn you on. And this also tends to lead to physical arousal if you are really psychologically turned on, but it doesn't have to, and it doesn't always. It can be a really beautiful positive feedback loop where the emotions that turn you on then create arousal in the body, physical arousal, and it just sort of escalates and continues, but it doesn't have to. And so think about this, though, as your emotional gas pedals. Just like that brilliant analogy by Emily Nagoski of sexual gas pedals and brakes in the wonderful book Come As You Are, the emotions that turn you on are a big chunk of your gas pedals. So just knowing that it's not just about sensory input. It's not just seeing or smelling someone you find sexy. It's also how you feel, how that person that you see or smell makes you feel. Or it could be something completely different. The stimulus varies widely. It could be sunlight on your skin. It could be a memory. It could be, a look across the room. It could be all kinds of things. Some folks, psychological arousal gets going from feeling powerful and some from feeling helpless, right? So it really runs the gamut. There's all kinds of feelings that turn people on. Some people get turned on by feeling wanted, loved, cared for, irresistible. And some people from feeling humiliated, belittled, or disgusting. Some people get turned on by feeling free, and some people by feeling captive. Some people by naughty, and some people by feeling respectable. So none of it is wrong, and it's all amazing. We have some more detail on that coming up in a full episode on erotic emotions and how to find the ones that work best for you and use them for more pleasure. But for now, just know they can be really varied, really important to your arousal process, and maybe use this as a curiosity jumping off point to think about when you are in an erotic moment with yourself or with a partner. How do you want to feel? What feels extra good to you? What feels extra arousing to you? What are those emotions for you? And as I said, we'll get to this more in depth and I'll give you more help on figuring that out later. But I want you to know there's both psychological arousal and physical arousal. And they play with each other sometimes, but not always. So next, up, though, in that dance, in that play team, is desire. So the verb to desire, just put really simply, means to want. So I'm going to use it that way. Wants and desire is totally interchangeable. We can also use desire as a noun too, right? A desire is just something we want to do or have. So that's not going to be unfamiliar to anybody who speaks English fairly well. But what is it we're talking about desiring when we're talking about sexual desire? What does it conjure for you when you think about sexual desire? What specifically are we saying is being wanted here? Now, you might say, Laura, that's super freaking obvious. We're talking about wanting sex. But what do we mean by sex? So for the vast majority of people, at least in the US, we assume by default that we're talking about wanting some sort of penis insertion sex. And it's really important to unpack this aspect of our language because it really impacts people. And it impacts women in particular detrimentally. Our use of the term sexual desire, including medical use, as code for insertion-based sex focusing on a penis, is based on a patriarchal system of defining sex for men based on men's typical wants and their anatomy. And this is a big problem, especially for women. And also for some men, it can kind of put a lot of pressure on things and it can really narrow our idea of possibility and it can really make us focus so much on having an erect penis sort of constantly available, right? So, but for women, I'm going to explain why this is a problem and I'm interested to hear your feedback and what you think about this and if it's affected you. So especially if you're one of those women who feels like you might have low desire or has been told you have low desire. Now, I'm going to take a quick jump into a couple other definitions before we come back to this. And responsive desire and spontaneous desire are two different types of desire you'll hear kind of bandied about by the experts in the sex world. So spontaneous desire just means you want sexual activity either with yourself or a partner without any particular stimulus occurring, right? It's just that moment where you're like, oh, I want to have some sex. You could be doing anything. You could be gardening. You could be drinking a cup of coffee. You could be whatever. Generally, the assumption is that males have more spontaneous desire. But I think since the whole sexual culture is really oriented towards them, and they also don't get slut-shamed into hiding it, I think it's pretty hard to say whether they actually have more spontaneous desire. And this is also a type of desire that's generally associated with higher sex hormone times. So for males, especially in puberty, and for many females, if you have a cycle, spontaneous desire during ovulation is more common, for example. And spontaneous desire is the one that in particular tends to decrease during perimenopause and menopause. But that doesn't mean that there's not all kinds of other desire and arousal available to you. So the other one you'll hear commonly in this sort of dichotomy of desires is responsive desire. So that just means that, like it says, you would tend to have more desire for sexual activity once something sensual or sexual has started. So in response to some activity, then the desire for more happens, right? I think it's kind of a slippery slope to focus completely on responsive desire with women, but it's generally thought that women have more responsive desire. It can be a bit of a problem to focus on responsive desire only, and because you can wind up in this situation where you're assuming that if you start, then you sort of should, quote unquote, want to continue. And there's so much pressure in our culture and assumption of continuing until the male partner is pleased that focusing on responsive desire for women can wind up also contributing to a lot of obligation sex and sort of unengaged sex for women. And here's an important thing. So even when experts are talking about responsive and spontaneous desire, they're still usually centering the male experience by default through the connotation of insertion-based sex. So it's typically either responsive desire is somehow supposed to make us want more insertion-based sex, or so that's a kind of a standard example. And even for queer women, it can be hard not to have a heteronormative view of sex as needing some sort of insertion to kind of qualify, because it's just so much of the dominant cultural assumption. But there's a lot of people that have really broken out of this mold, and I give them all the credit in the world. But for many people in our sort of standard US culture, when we hear talk of low desire, quote unquote, in women, and this is a medical/social term, I think it's really damaging because it's not clear that we're talking about low desire for insertion-based sex. If we said, instead of saying low desire, we're saying low desire for insertion-based sex every time, it might help people feel less like there's something wrong with them. Maybe they could think, oh, are there other types of sex we could be having, right? Maybe there's something else I desire. And that's the key thing. It makes a ton of sense to have low desire for insertion-based sex for a lot of reasons. I'm going to give you 4 of them that I think are really important. But even if this is you or if this is your partner, it doesn't mean that a woman has no sex drive or desire for sensual or sexual play just because they don't have experience a lot of desire for insertion-based sex. And it also doesn't mean she can't get back to some desire for that if she likes it on her own terms, right? So, okay, here are the 4 reasons why this is really damaging to women to define low desire without being clear what we're talking about desiring insertion-based sex. So first up, most women are not orgasming with insertion. Only about 30% of women do commonly orgasm with insertion, and about 70% of women don't. So we're talking the vast majority of women focusing on insertion sex to define desire is fundamentally missing our entire anatomical process of pleasure. So imagine if we define desire as desire for clitoral orgasm. That is not the world we live in, but I think it would be a world where many more women would identify as having more desire than they do right now. Secondly, what about all the other fun stuff? The flirting, the making out, the touching, intense eye gazing, neck kisses, feeling a lover slowly stalking you, the nice over-the-clothes grind, all the stuff that feels really pleasurable, arousing, and juicy for you. And I'm just giving you some examples. You can kind of tell what gets me going. But generally, Americans are reporting about 5 to 13 minutes of foreplay, and the majority of women needs 30 to 45 minutes to become fully aroused. So when we talk about desire and code it as if it's just for insertion sex, we're missing out on what women tend to need for arousal and desire. And this is really important, right? So we could ask, well, what is it that you do desire? And maybe a lot of people would love to do all that making out, touching, grinding kind of stuff. Maybe they have a lot of desire. It's just not for insertion-based sex. It's for more play. or what sometimes is called foreplay, which again centers insertion-based sex as if it's like the main course and everything else is just sort of secondary and comes before. So I hate that term, but everybody knows what it means, so I sometimes use it. All right, number 3. So even for the women who love, 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 love insertion sex, it is still best saved for late in the game. This is not where we want to start. This is not even the midpoint. Putting something inside your body is really vulnerable, and it takes a lot of arousal for a vagina or an anus to be ready for that. So assuming that desire means desire for something stuck in somebody is already way too far down the road. It's like assuming every time you ask someone if they're thirsty that they want to do a keg stand, and then wondering why they don't say they're thirsty, right? After years and years of that. So, fourth and last, if insertion-based sex has been the only meal on the menu for the last many years of your sex life, and you're not having a lot of foreplay or orgasms, or even if you are, it's often happening, maybe before you're fully aroused. Of course you won't want it, even if it's the best meal ever, right? You might not want the same dinner night after night for 10, 20, 30 years, right? So when I step back and I look at this, I'm like, seriously, that any woman has any desire left at all for insertion sex is kind of a fucking miracle. I guess that was pun unintended, but now I kind of intend it. And many of us are going to lose that desire, which is actually kind of more like it gets stolen from us. Many of us will lose it if we haven't yet. We'll lose it eventually if we don't get a handle on what it is we actually want, what our arousal needs are, and how to support ourselves in really expanding our menu. So we need to change how we think about desire and focus on all the lovely, delicious feedback loops between psychological arousal, what we actually desire and want, and our physical arousal. So whether you see yourself as a low desire person or not, the key is to change, and especially to prevent that, right, is to change how we approach these things. And I wonder if anyone is asking you, including yourself, what you actually do desire, what your body desires in the moment, what your body wants, what touches, what words, what looks, what experiences or sounds or smells or sensations. Chances are there's absolutely a bunch of things that you desire, a bunch of things that you want. And chances are that some of them may be psychologically or physically arousing to you. So that's your activity invitation for the week, is to ask yourself, what do I truly desire in my body? And look, some days it's going to be a nap, and that's good to know. Listen to your body, right? But here's the thing. It's really challenging to get out of our heads and listen to our bodies if we're not in the habit of doing that. It gets a lot easier when you are in the habit. So this week is really about seeing if you can get a little bit more information from your body by listening and being open to hearing its response. That means not shoulding on yourself, not saying, oh, I should want this or that or the other, or I should be able to tell, or blah, blah, blah. Just give yourself a break. Ask yourself like 5 times a day. It doesn't have to be sexual, right? Ask yourself at any given point, what does my body want right now? Maybe it wants a delicious stretch. Maybe it wants a snack. Maybe it wants a nap. Maybe it wants to run around a little bit. Maybe it wants to lift some heavy weights. Maybe it wants to go close its eyes and hide in a dark room. My body wants to do that at least once a day, usually a couple times. And anytime you're in any sort of sexual experience with yourself or with a partner, tracking what your body wants. What does my body desire right now? And allowing yourself to slow down enough to hear the answer and then honor it is a skill. And it's an amazing one, and it'll game change everything about your life, really, but definitely about your sex life too. But it takes practice to hear it, and it takes some patience, I will tell you. You may be disappointed this isn't a silver bullet that you can, or flip, like a switch you can magically flip, but it's not hard, and it actually comes pretty quickly if you work at it. So it's really fun, it's really easy, and it's really wonderful to have this relationship with your body. So just ask, what is it that my body wants right now? As many times a day as you can. And even if your brain decides that now is not the time to do that thing, maybe your body really wants a nap, but you really need to make the decision not to take a nap right now. Okay, maybe you can, take a quick 5-minute breathing break or something instead. Maybe you can just go have a glass of water and stretch. Maybe there's some way that you can honor yourself without doing the thing that your body wants. But even just knowing what your body wants is powerful. So don't shy away from knowing because you might not like the answer, right? It's totally okay. Let yourself know. All right, have fun with that, y'all. I'll see you here next time. If this podcast was helpful for you, please consider going to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leaving a 5-star review. Not only do I really appreciate your time doing that, but 5-star reviews really boost the show visibility, which helps people just like you who need it be able to find it. Thank you so much. I'll see you here next week.